6-year-old Tommy Ellison was playing in his own fenced backyard on a Sunday afternoon. His mother checked on him every few minutes from the kitchen window. At 3:47 p.m., he was building a sandcastle. At 3:52 p.m., the yard was empty. 5 minutes. A locked gate. No footprints leaving through it. For 3 years, Tommy Ellison was simply gone. No ransom note, no sighting, no trace. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning 3 years later, a 9-year-old boy walked into a gas station 2 states away and asked the cashier to call his mom. He remembered her phone number perfectly. He remembered almost nothing else. Here's what happened. The Ellisons lived in a quiet cul-de-sac outside Spokane, Washington. Their backyard was fully fenced, 6 feet high, with a single locked gate facing a narrow alley used only by the neighborhood's garbage collection service. Tommy's mother, Kelly, had stepped inside for less than 5 minutes to answer the phone, a habit she'd repeated safely dozens of times before. When she returned, Tommy's sandcastle sat unfinished. His shoes were still by the back steps. The gate was still locked from the inside, exactly as it had been. Police searched the alley, the neighborhood, and eventually a 50-mile radius. No footprints in the soft dirt beyond the fence. No broken locks. No witnesses. For 3 years, the case remained completely, agonizingly open. The gas station call came in at 8:14 a.m. on a Tuesday from a small town in Montana, nearly 400 miles from Spokane. The boy gave his mother's phone number without hesitation, a number that hadn't changed in 3 years. When Kelly Ellison arrived 6 hours later, she barely recognized her own son. Taller, different haircut, a faint scar near his left eyebrow that hadn't been there before. DNA confirmed it within 48 hours. This was Tommy. But when detectives asked him the most basic question, where he'd been for 3 years, Tommy's answer left the entire investigative team in stunned silence. I don't know. I don't remember anything before last year. Detective Naomi Fitch, brought in from the state's Child Recovery Unit, began piecing together fragments. Tommy remembered living in what he called the house with no windows upstairs, though he couldn't say where or with whom for the earliest portion of his disappearance. His clearest memories started roughly a year before he was found, living with a woman he called Aunt Carol, attending no school, rarely leaving a small rural property. A forensic child psychologist evaluating Tommy identified something significant. His memory gap wasn't necessarily damage or trauma-based suppression. It followed a pattern the psychologist had seen before in cases involving controlled substances used to keep young children compliant and passive during transport or early captivity. Someone had likely drugged Tommy for an extended period during the first stage of his disappearance, which meant somebody else had been directly involved before Aunt Carol ever entered the picture. Working from Tommy's fragmented descriptions, investigators tracked down the rural Montana property within 8 days. The woman living there, identified as 52-year-old Deborah Hayes, not Tommy's Aunt Carol, a name investigators believed was fabricated for him, was arrested without incident. Under questioning, Deborah claimed she had purchased Tommy 2 years earlier from a man she'd met online, believing, or claiming to believe, that the child had been legitimately given up by a struggling family member of the sellers. She provided a name, Curtis Renner, a man with no verifiable identity in any government database, using what appeared to be another entirely fabricated persona. Financial records showed Deborah had paid $6,000 in cash for Tommy, transferred through an intermediary account that had been closed and abandoned within days of the transaction. Tommy hadn't simply been taken, he'd been sold, passed from an unidentified original captor to a woman who, according to the fragmented picture emerging, may not have been the only buyer in a pattern investigators were only beginning to understand. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy, during a gentle, therapist-guided memory session months into his recovery, suddenly recalled a detail he hadn't mentioned before: a distinctive tattoo on the forearm of the person who had originally taken him from his backyard, visible during what he believed was his very first memory of captivity. That detail matched a cold case file from 18 months before Tommy's disappearance, an attempted abduction in Idaho that had been thwarted when the intended victim's older sibling intervened, allowing the family to provide a partial description, including the same tattoo. Cross-referencing that description against known associates of Deborah Hayes eventually identified 39-year-old Gary Voss, a man who had briefly done landscaping work at the Ellison family's previous residence 4 years before Tommy's disappearance, before the family had even moved to their current home. Voss had researched the family for years before acting. The 5-minute window in the backyard hadn't been luck. Voss had been surveilling the property for almost 2 months, timing Kelly's habitual phone calls to know exactly when the yard would be briefly unattended. Voss was located and arrested 11 days after the tattoo identification, working under a fabricated name at an unrelated job in Nevada. Confronted with the evidence, he eventually confessed to Tommy's abduction, admitting he had drugged the boy and transported him across 3 states over several weeks before selling him to Deborah Hayes through an online network investigators are still working to fully map. That network, according to ongoing federal investigation, appears to connect to at least 4 other unresolved missing children cases across 3 states, cases that had never previously been considered related. Voss was convicted of kidnapping and human trafficking charges, receiving a sentence of 32 years. Deborah Hayes received 12 years for her role, despite her claims of ignorance regarding Tommy's true origins. Tommy, now 10, lives with his mother again, along with ongoing therapy addressing both the trauma he can remember and the unsettling gap of the year he cannot. Kelly Ellison has said the hardest part isn't what happened to her son. It's the 18 months Voss spent quietly researching their family before he ever acted, time during which they had no idea anyone was watching at all. The federal task force formed in the aftermath of Tommy's case has since helped identify and rescue 2 additional children connected to the same network, using patterns first uncovered through his fragmented memories. This has been the Dark Truth Files. This story is fiction, but the pattern it reflects is real. Some threats don't announce themselves. They watch, they wait, and they study a family's routine longer than anyone would ever imagine. Stay aware, vary your routines, and remember, 5 minutes is sometimes all it takes.